Hello and welcome to the New Republic Salon. I'm Laura Marsh, the literary editor of the New Republic. Today I'm talking with George Saunders about his new book, A Swim in a Pond in the Rain. George, it's great to have you here. How are you doing? I think you're on mute. Yeah.
I am. Very good to be here. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And I guess I should say that George, there's a slight delay where George is on the audio because of the internet connection, but I don't think it's going to be a huge problem. But just wanted to make sure everyone knows that we're not just interacting with lots of awkward pauses. So the way we're going to do this is that George is going to start with a very short reading from the new book. And then we're going to have a conversation about it. And at the end, I'll open this up to questions from the audience. I'm sure lots of people are going to have questions for George. So if you want to ask him something, there is this Q&A function at the bottom of Zoom. And you can just type in a question there. And when we get to the Q&A part of the evening, I can just read them out and ask them for you. So over to you, George. Do you want to read from the book and just introduce the book a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, this is just from early in the book, kind of describing my my early difficulties as a writer. In my early 30s, I saw myself as a Hemingway-esque realist. My material, the time I'd spent working in the oil fields in Asia. I wrote story after story out of that material, and everything I wrote was minimal and strict and efficient and lifeless and humor-free, even though in real life I reflexively turned to humor at any difficult or important or awkward or beautiful moment. I had chosen what to write, but I couldn't seem to make it live. One day, serving as a note-taker on a conference call at the environmental engineering company where I was working, I started, out of boredom, writing these dark little Seussian poems. When I finished one, I'd draw a cartoon to go along with it. By the end of the call, I had around 10 of these poem and cartoon pairs, and because they weren't my real writing, I almost threw them out as I left work that day. But something stopped me. I brought them home, dropped them on the table, went off to see the kids, and then I heard from back at the table the sound of genuine laughter from my wife as she read those stupid little poems. This was, I realized with the start, the first time in years that anyone had reacted to my writing with pleasure. I had been getting from friends and editors all of those years the type of reaction writers dread. My stories were interesting. There was a lot going on in there, for sure. It was clear that I'd really worked hard on them. A switch got thrown in my head, and the next day I started writing a story in that new mode, allowing myself to be entertaining, setting aside my idea of what a classic story sounded like and my usual assumption that only things that happened in the real world were allowed to happen in a story. In this new story, which was set in a futuristic theme park, I was using an awkward, slightly overdriven corporate voice that came naturally to me when I thought, go ahead, be funny. I wrote it a few lines at a time, not sure where it was going, what its arc was, or its theme, or its message, just paying attention to the line-by-line energy, and especially to the humor, keeping an eye on my imaginary reader to see if she was still with me, if she, like my wife, was laughing from the other room and wanted more of the story rather than hoping it would mercifully end soon. In this mode, I found I had stronger opinions than when I was trying to be Hemingway. If something wasn't working, I knew what to do about it, immediately and instinctually, in the form of an impulse. Oh, that might be cool. Whereas before I'd been rationally deciding, in stiff obeisance to what I thought a story should or must do. This was a much freer mode, like trying to be funny at a party. When I finished that story, I could see that it was the best thing I'd ever written. There was some essential me-ness in it. For better or worse, no one else could have written it. The things that were actually on my mind at that time because they were in my life were in the story. Class issues, money shortages, work pressures, fear of failure, the oddball tonality of the American workplace, the failures of grace my state of overwork was causing me to commit every day. The story was oddly made, slightly embarrassing. It exposed my actual taste, which it turned out was kind of working class and raunchy and attention-seeking. I held that story up against the stories I loved and felt I'd let the form down. So this moment of supposed triumph, I'd found my voice, was also sad. It was as if I'd sent the hunting dog that was my talent out across a meadow to fetch a magnificent pheasant, and it had brought back, let's say, the lower half of a Barbie doll. To put it another way, having gone up about as high up Hemingway Mountain as I could go, having realized that even at my best I could only ever hope to be an acolyte up there, resolving never again to commit the sin of being imitative, I stumbled back down into the valley and came upon a little shithill labeled Saunders Mountain. I thought, it's so little, and it's a shithill. Then again, that was my name on it. This is a big moment for any artist, this moment of combined triumph and disappointment, when we have to decide whether to accept a work of art that we have to admit we weren't in as we made it, and of which we're not entirely sure we approve. It is less than we wanted it to be, and yet it's more too. It's small and a bit pathetic, judged against the work of the great masters, but there it is, all ours. What we have to do at that point, I think, is go over, sheepishly but boldly, and stand on our shithill and hope it will grow. And to belabor this already questionable metaphor, what will make that shithill grow is our commitment to it. The extent to which we say, well, yes, it is a shithill, but it's my shithill. So let me assume that if I continue to work in this mode that is mine, this hill will eventually stop being made of shit and will grow. And from it, I will eventually be able to see, and encompass in my work, the whole world.
Thank you for that reading. That's some of the most gracious and unpretentious advice I think that a distinguished writer could give to anyone who hopes to write. The book itself could be seen as quite daunting. The subtitle is "In which four Russians give a masterclass on writing, reading, and life." I think people do tend to approach the work of these great Russian writers with a sense of trepidation, that there is a kind of grandeur to this writing. It might be more common for a young writer to try and model themselves from Hemingway than to say, well, I'm going to be the next Chekhov. So coming from that experience you had as trying to be Hemingway and then realizing actually you're George Saunders, what was your approach to teaching these Russian writers to fiction? This is to fiction writers, right? You're teaching to people who aspire to write fiction.
Right. I'm teaching at Syracuse, and we get about 700 applications a year, and we select 6 of those to come and study fiction. So this kind of teaching is in some ways really easy, because there's not anybody there that isn't already a really accomplished writer. So what we're trying to do is get them to be sort of radically themselves, to do the thing that only they can do. So it's somewhat psychological work. It's kind of a little, maybe a little bit Zen-ish. You're trying to get to know the person and then subtly help them with whatever is obstructing them. So these Russians are really useful, I found, because they're so simple. They're very simple stories about, and in spite of that daunting reputation, the stories tend to be about, people in trouble, somebody who's having a difficulty. So they're easy to relate to. Also, because they're so old, a lot of the confusing, contemporary machine is gone. You just have samovars and snowstorms and that kind of thing. So it's a really nice way to think about story in its purest form. It's just kind of almost like if a musician analyzed Bach. There's nothing real. Nothing there except structure, really. So for that reason, it's a really useful tool to teach young writers with.
So there's 7 stories that you teach in the book, and that's winnowed down from a much wider range that you have been teaching in your class. And the 4 writers are Tolstoy, Chekhov, Turgenev, and Gogol. Why did you choose those 4?
Well, it was kind of a really complicated Rubik's Cube. I had originally, the class, we might cover 40 stories and maybe 12 writers. So that had to come down. And at some point, it was just a question of which stories taught the best. So my main criterion was, during a semester, which classes did I look forward to the most? There are certain of these stories that you bring them into a class and you just kind of rub your hands together with glee, because you know that the class is going to be exciting. So that was about 12 stories. And then from those, I had to kind of say, well, which 6 or 7 would work the best as a sort of to unify my essays in a certain way. So it's kind of a Rubik's Cube thing, or up until the last minute I was taking these out and putting it. But the idea was that the book should be kind of my parts of the book should be a coherent essay that uses the Russians as a kind of touchstone. So there were some I had to leave out Lady with Pet Dog, which is a great Chekhov classic, and I didn't put Isaac Babel in at all, and it was, kind of difficult. But the idea was to make a good teaching document, really.
So the kind of big question that runs through the book and that especially informs the first chapter is, what is a story? Can you have a go at answering that for us?
Yes. Well, I think, the real answer, I think, is we don't know. And if we're creators of stories, we should always leave that question up until the day of our death, and even then let it go on. Because I think the minute that you say what it is, then you're just executing the form. And I think the form demands more. It demands that you pay a kind of radical attention to each manifestation of the story. So the one you just finished actually doesn't have much to do with the one you just started. So there's kind of an extreme humility that you have to say, I know the rules I used last time, and I'll try to apply those, but I also have to be very sensitive to the moment when the story tells me not to condescend to it, But in general, I would say this, the form does make some demand. So if you pick up a 9-page story, I would say it's kind of implied that it's going to be a highly efficient unit. With only 9 pages, you don't have time for a 6-page digression. I think, the implication is that something important is going to happen during it, meaning important to you, the reader. So not just, intellectual pyrotechnics or a riff or extended cleverness, but something that actually speaks to the things that worry you, or concern you or excite you. And then within there, somehow, what I discovered is that, for me anyway, specificity is a real big thing. A story that starts off, some people were somewhere, doesn't interest me much, and I don't know how to complete it. But if you say, there were 4 Presbyterians in a bomb shelter, suddenly, that's something to work with. So throughout the book, I'm just saying that the form wants certain things from us. And that really it's kind of up to us to figure out what our version of a short story, what the rules are for our version of a short story. So I'm tiptoeing around it, too specific of an answer.
You talk about escalation a lot. How is the story raising the stakes, and are they being raised for us, or are they being raised for the character?
I think, again, that's another kind of expectation of the story. Like if I say, hey, Laura, I got up this morning and I had breakfast, and then I got done with breakfast and I did the dishes, and I just start listing the items of my day. At some point you get a little restless because this is supposed to be a story, which means the stakes should go up. There should be a sense of speeding towards something. So I think escalation is kind of built into the form. And I think the escalation is both for reader and for character. So you might see a story as it starts off in stasis, once upon a time something. We know from the beginning that change is coming, and it almost has to for the form. It's coming certainly to the characters, but in the best stories, I think it also comes to us. We are sort of implicated in our early expectations of the story, and then the story will run out ahead of us and surprise us in some way that in a way it throws light on our early expectations. So in other words, in a really good story, there's a sense that the character is having certain realizations and we're having those plus some other ones. So this is another part of the story. It can't be static. Whatever we come in with, whatever we feel on page 1 has got to be altered. But also, beautifully, that's all the writer has to work with. If we have an expectation on page 1, when we read A Christmas Carol and we see that Scrooge is a really stingy guy, well, automatically that story becomes about generosity, and it becomes about change. And so we wait to find out what Dickens thinks about change. Yeah, I don't know. Escalation.
You do a very interesting, you have a very interesting method. So in the first chapter, you have this thing where you only let us read one page of the story at a time. And then you ask all these questions about what's happening, what's going to happen. It's a super, super close reading in real time of this short Chekhov story in the cart. I was almost struck by the time I finished reading that passage or that exploration of the story by like, this story is so perfect. Like every detail in the story is doing something that it would be impossible for anyone else to write a story that works like this, because it almost just seems like so intensely over-engineered that like every single word is intentional, and like it's almost hard to believe that this was an organic product of someone's imagination. Do you feel like sometimes that raises the bar so high that it could almost sort of prohibit?
Yes, that's a beautiful description of it. And I think, Chekhov had this incredible gift of making stories like that. And one of the things I keep coming back to in the book is basically, how did he do that? Did he know how perfectly made these were? Did he plan in advance? I don't think so. I think he was just maybe that one in every 400 or 500 years person who had such an innate sense of story and of efficiency that he, would put out some stuff in the first page and just almost automatically he knew how to make everything useful. So that's one of the benefits of that method, is to sort of gauge and say, well, if we're going through it a page at a time, which is very irritating, by the way, for when I do it in class, I always barely get out with my life. But it does make you see the story as a system, a very, efficient little system wherein something is brought into the field of play. And then I would say that on a subconscious level, we're waiting for everything to be beautifully used. We're waiting for us to get to the end of the story and have that feeling like, oh, nothing was wasteful in this story. How he did it, I don't know, but you're absolutely right. And there's a group of his stories. That's one of them. Many of his late period stories, they all are like that. You get to the end and the first read, it almost feels anecdotal. There's not that feeling of like what Hemingway called the smell of the midnight oil. Like he's not sweating over the language. It's all pretty casual. It sounds like an anecdote. And then when you start looking at it, it's just this precision-made, beautiful thing that has, at the back of it is this great soul, I think, somebody who really loved life and was deeply curious about it.
But I think it's in that chapter that you say that the short story is a harsh form. It's just sort of an unexpected phrase, or that, to me at least. What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, I think, I say elsewhere that it's a lot like a joke, and the joke is a harsh form. I mean, if you're having a nice drinking night and someone says, oh, I got a great joke, they've just put themselves, under an incredible amount of pressure, because we all know that at the end of a joke, we're not supposed to say, oh, that was, yeah, okay. That's the wrong reaction. So in the same way that when you pronounce that you're about to tell a joke, a laugh is expected, the story has something similar. There's something that happens in a great story at the end of it. And people have tried to describe it in different ways. But once you've read enough stories, you kind of know that feeling. It's that kind of, oh, this is a story feeling. If it doesn't happen, it just doesn't. And that's a drag. So, and it doesn't happen because you necessarily should decide it should happen or will it to happen. It's sort of a more magical thing than that. I think, elsewhere in the book, I talk about the fact that the writer is kind of trying to, I use the phrase surrender to the energy of the story. That's a little new age and a little vague, but I think what it means is a story, once you get it to a certain point, it has something it wants to do. It has a direction it wants to go in. And one of the most beautiful things about writing them is that it's really not coming from you. I don't feel like I'm in control of that thing. The story has a certain desire. If you follow that, you'll get to the sort of the punchline, but it will often surprise you as much as anybody else. Surprise there. So in the book, I talk about the sort of curse of writing, which is we all, especially if you're, if you want to be a writer, it means so much to you. You don't want to sound like anybody else. You don't want your stories to be mediocre. So the natural human impulse is to over control them, to plan them out and super, engineer them before you start. And unfortunately, I think that's the way to write kind of boring stories. So what you have to do in a complicated way is, even though you are a control freak, I'm a control freak, and you want the stories to be beautiful, you have to kind of surrender to the energy of the story itself, which is a very interesting lifelong project. But Chekhov seemed to have, be just a total natural.
So I think that what you do after that chapter is slightly mischievous. I read the Chekhov story that opens, and it's sort of exhilarating to read one page at a time with your commentaries and feeling like I'm focusing so much on this story. I'm getting something from every line. Like I haven't read like this in quite some time. Then I move on to the Turgenev story, The Singers. And I felt, I have to admit, like I read for a living, I'm an editor, and I felt like I can't concentrate on the story. It's just, I'm resisting it. What's happened to me.
Right.
And then of course your commentary is all about that.
Yeah, that's always a fun one. That usually comes about a third of the way into the semester. So I've got their basic trust, and we're having a good time, and we're really happy because we're reading these Russians. And then I assign that story. And as a teacher, you have a bit of that, an ego investment in what you assign. You want the students to love it, and you don't want them to think you're an old fuddy-duddy. So then we come into class the next day, and I can see that they're just not comfortable. They're all like, "Oh God, George just lost it." He's because the story is long-winded. It definitely has an old-fashioned feeling to it. It's very kind of didactic and digressive and everything. So what will happen is we'll have a very awkward first couple minutes when they're kind of tepidly praising things about it. And then someone will finally say, what is with this digression in this story? And then everyone laughs, and we know it's going to be a good discussion. So the point of that story really is to say, and I teach it kind of to ease my young writers' anxiety a little bit, because as we've been saying, the story is a tough form. Once you've read a few and love them, it's possible to become very nervous when you're writing. You don't want to screw up your perfection, then you can get so tight that you can't do anything. You can't achieve a real moment of spontaneity or beauty. So with this story, what I'm trying to show is that it's a kind of a hot mess of a story. There's a lot of problems with it, and especially for a contemporary reader, it's almost hard to make it through. And yet, when you become friends with it a little bit and you forgive Turgenev some of these surface level flaws, it's a really gorgeous story. And the story is actually commenting on, I would say, Turgenev's own narrative awkwardness. He kind of knew it. He knew that he wasn't really someone who could make situations dramatic. So it's in a way that I teach the story to say, even though we all want to write perfect stories that are above reproach, that kind of story doesn't exist. And what we have to do to find our real power as writers is kind of say, well, I'm going to take my strengths, but with my strengths, there's going to come some weaknesses. And just as is the case with personality, you can't just take the good stuff. You have to take your defects along with your superpowers. So I noticed that after that, there's a bit of an easing in the room. And I think the attitude becomes, okay, let's not worry about whether these stories are perfect. Let's treat them sort of as cadavers, on the slab, on the story slab. And let's allow ourselves to examine the ways that the strengths and the weaknesses of the story actually are intimately related. And then when the students go to write their own stories, that's kind of a help, I think. You're not going to write your most powerful story without it having some defects or having some something for which you have to compensate, maybe, if that makes sense. But you're not alone in that reaction.
No, I felt glad that I was reading the book where I could have that reaction, but I didn't have to tell anyone that I felt like I'm not engaging with this somehow. I would definitely have been one of the students being like, well, it does something quite interesting in this line, and maybe there's something there.
Yeah.
So
but
just
this
for
is one of the other things about in the book that I try to emphasize is that this these strong reactions that we have to fiction, those are so valuable. And in some other parts of our life, we're trained to suppress the strong reactions. But I tell my students that those very visceral, undeniable reactions are actually their it's gold for them. You know, to say I really love this line, I really hate this line, even to have a strong negative reaction to Turgenev or something. That is actually what we have to hone as writers. It's the only thing we have to work with are those. I do an exercise in one of the classes where I just take 5 opening paragraphs from 5 different stories in different magazines. I just literally pick them randomly, and then I photocopy them onto one sheet, and I tell the students, I say, I'm going to go out of the room. I want you to rank these 5 first paragraphs, and I'll be right back. So I come back 5 minutes later, and the thing is, I haven't told them on what basis to rank those, but they're on fire. They're already all finished, and they've got it ranked. And so that's a really good exercise in showing them that they all have radical preferences. You know, you say, why did you rank this one so low? What was the exact moment when you turned against this one? Or when was the moment you decided this was your favorite? And it's so interesting, you know, there'll be people who say, I hate this one because it's got descriptions of vegetation. I can't stand it. Okay, you know. Or another person will cite a particular phrase that really did something to them. And so the point of the exercise is to say we really do have very, very strong micro opinions. And maybe you could say, you know, the craft of becoming a writer is to identify and bless and honor those micro opinions and let them speak freely.
So just for people who haven't read the book or had a chance to look at the book yet, the stories, The Singers by Turgenev, what are the parts of the story that you think people resist? I mean, why do you think it's, what are the flaws that it illustrates?
Yeah, he does a very old-fashioned thing, which is he kind of just says, it's set in a pub, and he just sort of described every single person in the pub. And he does it in this way that's, for me anyway, is very hard to imagine. He just sort of lists people's facial features and their clothes in this kind of almost encyclopedic way. And, you know, we don't really do that anymore. And that piece a little bit was sort of anthropological. I mean, it was you know, an upper class Russian gentleman going into a low class pub and sort of pulling back the curtain. But he doesn't, and he knew this, and Henry James said it of him. Turgenev wasn't very good at blending description and action. So basically, you know, you go in there, he stops the camera, goes around and describes every person, starts the camera, stops again, describes some other things. So it's very, it doesn't feel very contemporary in the way that but even in his time, I think he was considered a little bit clunky in the way that he did things. So there's one really funny part where he's been describing for pages, and then he says, and there's a singing contest, and it's about to start, and he says, however, before we begin, perhaps I should say a little bit about my characters. Like, you know, you've been doing that for the last 15 pages. But
so
but
obviously
all of that,
the,
you know, I'm always moved at the end of that story.
obviously all of the writers that you have included in this book are great writers, and that's not in question. But do you think that there's something to be gained from looking at stories that are kind of like B- stories sometimes, but where it's sort of a second-rate story or even a second-rate writer, but they do one thing like really well? Like this is a sort of achievable,
Yes.
copyable move that this person is like totally nailed.
Right. Yes. And you know, one of the most interesting things is to take a story like that and compare it to the best work of a writer. There's a Chekhov story called The Name Day Party, which is very good. And if anybody wrote it, they'd be happy. But I would say it's not on the level of, say, In the Cart or Lady with Pet Dog or Gooseberries. And it's so interesting to read that one and read, say, In the Cart, which I think was written within a few years, you know. And there's just something missing in The Name Day Party. And it's really hard to articulate what it is. And what I tell my students is maybe, you know, we don't need to articulate it. There's some value in just holding up a masterpiece versus a pretty good story by the same writer and just letting that resonate a little bit, because that will tell us something essential about the form. But I thought it would be a really interesting class to teach the B, as you say, the B- stories of all the great writers. It would be consoling, for one thing, to see that not even Chekhov, you know, hit a home run every time. Yeah.
You have this thing, you talk about things that you can't help noticing when you read. Can you just talk us through that kind of idea, like that sort of as an approach to reading?
Yeah. So I think, and it relates to the Turgenev. As you start reading a story, there will come a moment where you just notice an excess. Maybe it's positive, maybe it's negative. You notice, whatever, alliteration, or you notice that the person seems really obsessed with color, or you notice a weird flashback or something like that. Just, and I'd say it's just a thing we can't help noticing. Maybe if we don't even notice it consciously, but somehow it sticks with us a little bit. This is not a bad thing. Actually, it's the story being excessive, and sort of the unspoken rule of a story is that if it's excessive in some way, that excessiveness is going to prove to be essential, be useful. So, for example, in the Metamorphosis, you get the first line is Gregor Samsa woke up to find he'd been transformed into a giant beetle. That's an excess. We know that doesn't really happen, and a little voice in your head goes, no, that's not true. Well, we put that in the cart. We say, okay, we're going to now assume that Kafka is going to make that little, sacrifice on our part worthwhile down the line. And of course, he does beautifully. So again, this is another anxiety reducer for young writers to say, of course, your story is going to be fucked up. Of course, it's going to have lumps and it's going to be weird, and your secret passions are going to make goiters, on your surface. That's okay. It's, the idea is not to write a story that nobody can criticize. The point is to let the passion express itself, and then notice that you've done that, and somehow, capitalize on it. So in some ways, it's a very forgiving way of reading a story, which says, since it's a made-up thing, made up in somebody's head, there are going to be bumps under the carpet. There have to be. So don't worry about making a story that's perfect. But one of your powers as a writer is to note the imperfections and then see if the imperfections are giving you hints about how to finish the story, if that makes sense.
Some of those imperfections can be sort of details about how things work, the mechanics of the daily life of the characters in the story. And I actually have a question for you about one of those that I got very hung up on when I was reading the book. So in Gooseberries, the character who's hosting them says that he hasn't bathed since spring. And I don't have any background in Russian literature either, and I don't really understand. I didn't understand the mechanics of the bathing, but it seemed to me like if I did have that information, I would understand what he meant by saying he hadn't bathed since spring, and when he bathes, brown water runs off him, like just soaked with dirt.
Yeah.
How do you advise people to, because you're teaching this class, right, to people who are not specializing in Russian, you're not coming from that background yourself, like how do you cope with these details?
Right. Well, this is the beauty of these stories, and that's a great detail you picked up on. In that case, your reaction is correct, which is, wow, that's weird. A guy he makes a point of explaining, somewhat embarrassed that he hasn't bathed, and then he gets in the water, and there's this really funny moment where the water turns brown around him, and everyone just kind of looks at it like, whoa, yeah. So I think, but you're right. But that's because it's Chekhov, that's not an empty detail. And what we find out is that guy is kind of a workaholic, basically. He's running this estate. He's running it kind of non-traditionally. So he's right there among his peasants. He lives with them. He doesn't do the sort of normal gentlemanly thing of exempting himself from the work. So consequently, the farm, you get the sense, is on the edge of disaster. So he's always working, and he never takes a day off, which is why he's so dirty. And I think the idea is that they have a pond outside in which they bathe, but it's kind of a little bit of an excursion. So he's just been too busy to bathe. And as we read the story, we see that in a very subtle way, that enters into the whole rhetoric of the story, which is about happiness and about enjoyment. And he's somebody who has put aside enjoyment entirely, and he's just a worker, So that's how I would read it anyway,
Right, that makes a lot of sense. And also a weird thing that happens is these two guys go over to someone's house, and the first thing he says is like, let's all take a bath together and I'll give you some fresh clothes.
Yeah.
Which is not something that really happens in like Jane Austen. I mean, obviously that's a cultural detail.
Much, no.
But moving on to things that are
and
truly...
the funny thing is,
Oh, no, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that I didn't know this until I was researching the book, but that exact thing happened to Tolstoy and Chekhov. Chekhov was nervous about meeting Tolstoy, who was older and was this great eminence, and he kind of didn't want to meet him because he was afraid he wouldn't like him. So he goes to meet Tolstoy at his estate, and Tolstoy, who's quite old at that point, says, "I'm on my way to take a bath. Would you come with me?" So they walked down to the pond, and Tolstoy stripped off, and Chekhov. So the two great writers of Russia, they were naked in the pond, kind of talking. And I think that the story came out of that moment actually, because Chekhov expected to not like Tolstoy, to find him very didactic, and in fact, they really hit it off. And yeah, but that's not something we do so much anymore. It's not the introductory bath.
Right. No, I really liked that detail from your book, and the idea that maybe this character is even some version of Tolstoy. So before I move on to the questions from the audience, because there's a ton of questions, wanted to just end with a departure from realism, which is your chapters on nose. And if you could just tell me a little bit about sort of like how that story fits in with the rest of the book, and what you're trying to encourage people who want to write, and also just people who want to read in a more alert way, to do with that.
Yeah. Well, I kind of put it in as a check on myself, because when I'm analyzing Chekhov and Tolstoy, my system works. It's a very analytical system about causation and specificity. And then when you try to apply it to Gogol, it doesn't quite work. Gogol is a really unruly masterpiece. So I kind of pledged to myself, I'd put it in there just to keep myself honest. I'm a former engineer, and sometimes I can get a little reductive. And I found this out. I taught some Toni Morrison one time, and my method doesn't work. She's too brilliant. There's too much. There's too much beauty there. Somehow it doesn't conform to these sort of laws that I talk about. So I put it in there just to remind myself and the readers that these stories can work in a million different ways. Anytime you say a story must do this, somebody will come along and make a great story out of contradicting that rule. But I think what Gogol does, what we can understand, is he knew all the rules. He knew how a classic story was told. But somehow his genius was that he knew he couldn't tell a great story within that framework. I think he was a working class person from Ukraine, a strange person, it sounds like. So I think early on he figured that comedy was the way for him to go. And that story in particular, and another one called The Overcoat, they kind of function by the narrator pretends to be an educated person about to tell you a story, and then he completely screws it up. So there's a lot of fun to be had with literary conventions and his inability to work within them. But then somehow the stories become very deep about that tendency of human beings, to want to be know-it-alls and to control things and to dominate others with their intellectualism, and how life just doesn't like that. And so I think, for my money, that The Nose is maybe the best story in the book, in a very wild way. I really love it, and I worked like hell on an essay, and I'm like, I don't know if that's true or not. It's that story just doesn't really want to be tamed in any way.
Yeah, it's funny because it's very weird, and then it does weird things within that don't make any sense. Like my favorite moment in it is when he tries to place the ad for his nose at the newspaper, and the guy that runs the classified section says, "This is absurd, we can't do that." But then his reason for saying it's absurd is, someone could sue us for libel. We could be, it's just like that. What? Right. That doesn't make any sense. It's very kind of Alice in Wonderland.
And
that's
a perfect, it's a perfect Gogolian moment. And then it doesn't make sense. And nobody in the frame of the story, including the narrator, says it doesn't make sense. They just roll on, just like real life. Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of like, you think, oh, this person will be the voice of reason in the story. Everything else will be weird, and this is the person who's the voice of reason.
Right. And there's none.
They're crazy too. Well, on that note, let me go to the
perfect.
questions.
And, I was
Sorry.
gonna say you hit on it. It's the absence of a voice of reason that's Gogolian. You know that you read the story and you say there's no voice of reason here, and then sometimes when you go back into the world, you go, oh God, there's no voice of reason here either. You know, I think there is, but actually there isn't.
Yes, and I think we all have had that experience, especially recently. So I'm going to go to the questions from the audience because there's so many, and so I think it would be good to make sure we have enough time for some of these. The first one I'm going to read isn't a question, but it's just someone who decided to say, "I believe I'm on, but you can't see or hear me, and I see and hear you." So I just wanted to read that. The next question, let's see, is someone is saying, George, a disclaimer. I read A Swim in a Pond in the Rain 3 times. Once as hard copy, then as an ebook, then as an audiobook, which was a gift to mankind. My question is twofold as a reader and writer. As a reader, do you find there's an essential difference in prose when read on paper versus digitally versus orally? Second, as a writer, do you often extol the beauty of not knowing? Do you find that not knowing would serve the poet or even the screenwriter, which I am, as much as it does the prose writer?
Yes. I'm a big fan of. I only edit on the page, and I don't do the thing where I read things aloud. There's something about seeing it that makes me know how to edit it. And then for the second question, I think yes. I don't know about screenwriting. That's something I'm not very good at, and I know it tends to be more structured. But the basic principle of not knowing is that when you're in that close communication with your reader, she is actually about 10% smarter than you are. She can tell where the narrative is about to go, and if you just go there, it causes a drop in her interest. So the not knowing has to do with being willing to forego your existing plan as a writer. So in short stories, that works really well because you don't really have to have a plan anyway. For novels, I think it's a little harder. I think that sense has to be gotten a different way. And I have novelist friends who will say, yeah, I know where it's going generally. I just don't know how it's going to get there. And that's where the not knowing comes in. So I think to me, it's more about imagining yourself in a really high level communication with the reader and trying to honor her by not phoning it in, by not having a plan. And so the worst moment is when you have a plan, the story has a different plan, and you honor your plan. The story has an energetic, spontaneous plan that's charged with subconscious wisdom, and you say, no, 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 that doesn't fit with my outline. I think that's probably true in all forms, that moment of clinging to the pre-existing form, which is totally understandable, but it also tends to kill the work. So,
well, here's another question. Writing is painful for all sorts of reasons, sometimes so much that sticking with a sentence or the idea that a sentence is gesturing at can feel unbearable. Do you have any advice on how to navigate that pain?
Well, I mean, sometimes when I'm teaching, I try to say if thinking about a thing a certain way makes it unworkable, we're allowed to change the way we think about it. So I assume that the question has to do with the emotional pain that a sentence brings up. I'm not sure if I'm reading it right. I to be honest, I tend to kind of feel emotional about something the first time I go through it, maybe, but then I take refuge in the idea that it's a sentence, and a sentence is there partly to compel the reader to keep going, to be vivid and specific enough that the reader renews her commitment to the work. So that allows me to kind of put aside, to some extent, my emotional involvement in the work, and to sort of see it as a technical issue. And for me, technical is a holy word. I don't mean it in a dismissive way at all. So I'm not sure that's the kind of question I think I would have to know more to really give a helpful answer. But in general, I think it's fair to say that there's no correct approach to writing. There really isn't. Books like mine notwithstanding, there's no correct approach. There's just the one that works for you. So I think one thing I encourage my students to do is if you get to a place where you're blocked and obstructed, just recognize that the mindset you're using is somewhat arbitrary. You're allowed to think about your work in different ways than are automatic to you. You can actually rewire yourself to think about it in a way that makes it easier to be productive, if that makes sense.
This question is somewhat related. You suggested that we surrender to the energy of the story, but sometimes the energy comes in spurts. Today, it's highly energetic and bursting at its seams. Another day, it's lethargic and refuses to budge. I've heard other writers suggest to simply show up every day and write, but it's so hard when this
Mm.
energy from the story varies day by day, almost dictated by the graph of life itself. How does one deal with this and
Mm.
overcome
Mm.
it?
Yeah, that's a great question. That has the feeling of someone who's really working at it. I would say maybe I would just clarify slightly. What I mean by the energy of the story is actually maybe a little simpler than that. The hmm. So, well, first, one answer is I think that's right. If you're giving yourself 6 months to finish a story or a year, that will allow all those different yous to come to the table: the lethargic one, the puppy dog one, the self-doubting one, the confident one. And over time, if you're a good reviser, those things will kind of make an accommodation, and the result will be something that you can stand behind. On a simpler level, what I mean by the energy is simply this. I say this all the time, but it's like if you had a meter in your head that said positive over here and negative here. For me, the whole act of writing is you pick up your stupid text that you're kind of sick of, and you try to imagine that you aren't sick of it, that you just found it on a bus bench or something, and you start reading it, and part of you is reading it, and part of you is watching that meter. And if you're in the positive, that's great. But normally, always, at some point, the needle will drop a little into the negative. At that point, that's what I mean by honoring the energy of the story. The energy of the story just dropped there. So then, what I do is I just, first of all, acknowledge that. That's the hardest thing because it's been perfect so far. This story's been perfect for 3 weeks, and suddenly you think there's a drop. Honor it, and then do what you can to fix that one little phrase so that the energy pops up again. And that's a very hard to explain moment, but it's intuitive and it's fun, or at least it's sort of spontaneous. That's what I mean by honoring the energy of the story. A lot of times a story will take a negative turn. It'll be, and I don't mean it slows down, but I mean it gets somehow, I don't know, boring, or it throws you out of it. That moment is where the energy of the story is crying out to you. So it doesn't really, to me, it doesn't really matter. My energy doesn't really matter, but my ability to see what the story wants me to do. It's a deep subject. It's kind of hard to articulate, but
Well, so here's a question about editing story, but not yourself. How much are your own stories edited by the editors of publications in which they first appear? Can you quantify this? 80, 90, 99% done when they get accepted? Thank you.
uh, yeah, that's a great. I publish almost exclusively with the New Yorker, and my editor there is Deborah Treisman, and we've been working together for a long time. So there's a lot of editing, or a lot of really smart, helpful editing, and I take almost all of it. Because she's a master, and so she doesn't give edits that aren't really, that she hasn't really dwelled in. Um, so I think my advice would be if you trust the editor, and the big question is try it. Try. I tell this to my students: just try my cuts. You can always revert, and sometimes when you cut a little more than you think you want to, you actually find something that's more like your true voice as a result of the cut. So my feeling is always, personally, I try to be really humble and really almost suppliant with an editor, because if they're good, they're not making ego-based cuts. They're not cutting just because they want their hand in it. They're doing it really for the good of the piece. So I would say, I always send the story to the New Yorker thinking, finally, this is the one that won't need any editing, and then the galleys come back, and of course they're covered. It's covered with things. And then once I start the first paragraph, I'm so grateful because, these are improvements. So I think it's okay. I think it's really good to be energetic in that way, especially since you always have the right of reversion, And I'm sure, Laura, as an editor, you must appreciate that kind of
Oh,
willingness on the part of your writers.
Absolutely. I mean, someone who is as receptive to edits as what you've just described is an angel sent from heaven as a writer. I actually do want to follow up on your response because you've been writing for a long time and had incredible success. And it's more, you could reject all edits if you wanted, I'm sure. So it's kind of a conscious choice to be this open to being in dialogue with an editor.
It's a self-protective choice because I will go back and read the initial thing I sent to Deborah, and I just think, oh my God, thank God that she, that she was there to, because at that level, editors like you and like Deborah are you're it's an amazing superpower to be so tuned into a piece that you can make 300 little edits and the whole thing comes up a whole level, in terms of being fast and intelligent and tight. And so, no, I would be terrified if I didn't have an editor at this point, because they see what you're trying to do and they help you do it. And you've been in it for so long that your vision is a little cloudy, so it's a great blessing.
So here's another question.
And it might also, if I could say one more thing.
Yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry. It's an important point, which is when I was a young writer, I thought, okay, I want to be a great writer. Leave me alone. Every word has to be mine. That's how I prove I'm great, Then as you get more mature, you're like, nobody is a great writer. It's so hard, and anything that anybody can do to help you, is appreciated. So you see it as kind of, instead of being your product, it's something that you're channeling, and all the people, your editors, are helping you channel that thing. And that's somehow a much nicer enterprise, I think.
Yeah. And I can see the earlier version you're talking about, the younger writer who resists edits, I completely sympathize with, because an editor sending a query, when it's just a question, that's like a horrible, painful problem that you have to solve, and often feel like I can't solve this, so my story's broken, and that's the end. And this is a disaster.
Right.
This is awful. This is happening to me. And then you feel like, why are you doing this to me?
Right.
I've definitely felt like that about other editors.
Right.
So it's definitely not a painless process. Okay, here's a question. This is a very simple question. Do you read Russian, and do you wish you did?
I don't, and I do. I don't read Russian, and I wish I did. And this book is kind of, at the first chapter, I just confess I don't read it. So we're really just treating these as found objects that we're acting as if they were written in English, even though we know that they weren't. And that, especially with somebody like Gogol, you're missing so much of the humor and so much of the jokes and so much of the musicality. But still, they're great. And so to just assume that they were written by somebody in Hoboken in English, you can still do a lot of really useful work with them.
Yeah, it's something I enjoyed about the book is you compare translations sometimes too, which is, if you don't speak Russian, at least that's a way of getting to some of the sort of untranslatable nuance of the story.
Right. Yeah. I had a really funny experience early in my teaching career where I had a colleague from the Russian department come over and talk to us about translation. It was about the third class of the semester, and she was so good at it. But you saw that we weren't reading anything like the originals. We were reading some strange, messed up monstrosities, and it almost killed the class because we were like, well, what are we doing if we're that far off the mark? She had one part in a Gogol story where he's described as having, all the English translations describe this guy as having thinning hair, or he has a bald spot. And she said, no, actually in the Russian, it says he's got a bald spot on the front of his forehead. So here, which everybody has a bald spot there. But that's the joke. But all the English translators couldn't quite, bring themselves to do that. So they sort of normalized it, and a whole joke goes by, and and so you multiply that by a 30-page story, and you don't know what you're reading,
Yeah, I found the comparison of the translations at the end of Alyosha the Pot kind of disturbing, because I had read that story and felt like I knew exactly the look of amazement that would be on a dying man's face. And then reading the different translations and reading some of the comments that your friends had given you who speak Russian, I was really doubting, like, what is happening in that final moment, which obviously is what the story wants you to do as well.
Right. Yeah. it's I would love to be able to read Russian. But even when you're writing English, you that's in revision you'll mess with something and you'll have 4 or 5 different translations of your own sentence and language. You can't live with it, can't live without it.
Well, so this might be maybe a second to last question, which is which of your own stories, and this is in like a scare quotes, punchlines, surprised you the most?
It was a story called Sea Oak that's in Pastoralia, and there was basically I killed off this lady, this old working class lady, and she was the most interesting person in the book, and so I had about 2 or 3 years of just reading up to a certain point, and that needle would drop into the negative, and I'm like, I don't know, I don't know what to do with this. So, and it was very, one of those moments where you start to really beat up on yourself a little bit, like you're supposed to be a professional writer, you're teaching writing, why can't you finish this stupid story? And so I knew that she had to come back into the story, so I tried to bring her back in dreams and in flashbacks, and it was always a little tepid, So one day I was actually in the shower, which is where, that or taking a walk is a good place for an insight. And I just said, man, what is wrong with you? Why can't you finish the story? You know that woman has to come back. And just out of some weird part of my brain, something said, from the dead. And I was like, oh, God, yeah, she has to come back from the dead. And I had I'd watched a lot of Tales from the Crypt and stuff as a kid, so I knew how to do that. But it literally took 2 or 3 years of writing really tepid, conventional endings to that story for that little psychological breakthrough to come through. And so the punchline came to me just like that, and then I finished the story in about a week. So that's the other thing I try to tell my students is that, your work, when things are going badly, that doesn't mean they're going badly. It means that you're exhausting a certain kind of literal energy that's not letting you finish the story. But back there in the machine room, something's going on that might provide you with that moment of sort of aha moment that you're waiting for. It's faith. You have to have faith that even work that seems bad is actually good.
Okay, and so this is going to be the last question. I just want to say to anyone else who asked questions, because there's so many, I can't get through all of them, but I'm sure that there will be more events like this and more opportunities to raise questions. So this is the last one. I'm sure you have a story recommendation list a mile long. What are your own most glaring reading omissions? So, I mean, what's like a book that you feel like you're going to read it one day, but that you haven't?
It's the Proust, the Remembrance of Things Past. I know that book will be important to me, but I'm terrified because I feel like if I read it, I'll want to write about my childhood, which I don't really think would be very good. So I know it'll be like a 6-year arc of reading the books, going, oh, I have to do that, and then failing at it, and then I'll be 100 years old and it'll be too late. So that's one I have not read. Yeah. So that's probably the. I mean, that comes to mind instantly as something that I know I should read and I haven't, but someday.
Yeah, no, I feel like that's one of the top answers. Well, I've read the first 4 volumes of Remembrance of Things Past, so I guess the other 2 is would definitely be on my list.
Can I skip them? Is that okay? Do you think?
No, you definitely should. It's weird that I stopped. I don't know why I just stopped. I was like 4. That was an amazing experience, and I don't need to go further right now. Okay, well, that's all we have time for. George, thank you so much for this conversation about the book.
Thank you so much.
I had so much fun reading it, and I know that other people will. The book is out. It's A Swim in a Pond in the Rain. And stay tuned for more of these events. Our next one will be next month with Louis Menand on his new book, The Free World. Have a good night.